At 3 in the morning, somewhere in the northern Arabian Sea, a routine satellite pass picked up something that should not have been there. Not one carrier strike group. Not two. A density of American naval power that, when fully mapped, accounted for almost half of the United States' deployable carrier force, arranged in a quiet arc stretching from the eastern Mediterranean through the Red Sea and into the waters off the Gulf of Oman. The headlines called it a show of force. Analysts called it pressure. Tehran called it provocation. None of those descriptions touched the real story. Because 7 carriers near Iran is not the message. 7 carriers is the surface of the message. The deeper signal sits in what is not on the public map. It sits in a force that is neither announced, nor positioned, nor formally deployed, but is structurally ready to arrive faster than anyone expects. The real story is not the 7 carriers the world is counting. It is the 8th one nobody is talking about. And that 8th carrier changes the entire equation. To understand why, you have to first look at what the visible 7 actually represent. The United States Navy operates 11 nuclear-powered supercarriers. At any given time, only a fraction are deployable. The rest are in deep maintenance cycles, midlife refueling, post-deployment stand-down, or workup training. In normal posture, the Navy keeps 2 to 3 carriers forward deployed across the entire globe. 3 is considered heavy. 4 is considered a crisis surge. 5 begins to strain the rotation cycle. Anything beyond that is no longer routine deterrence. It is preparation. So when 7 carriers, or the equivalent strike capacity of 7, begin orbiting the same theater, the rotation math itself becomes the headline. Because to put that much steel into one region, the Navy has to pull from the Pacific, delay scheduled relief, extend deployments past their planned windows, and accept gaps elsewhere on the map. That is not a routine flex. That is a deliberate concentration. And concentration of that magnitude is never about presence. It is about timing. That is the visible layer. The real problem sits underneath it. Because Iran's planners are not counting hulls. They are counting clocks. They are calculating how long a strike package can stay on station, how many sorties an air wing can generate per day, how many Tomahawks ride in the escort screens, how many destroyers carry SM-6 and SM-3 interceptors, how many submarines are silent under the thermocline, and most importantly, how quickly that force can be reinforced if the first phase of any conflict consumes ammunition faster than projections allow. 7 carriers is not the threat. The reinforcement behind 7 carriers is the threat. And that is where the 8th carrier enters the picture. Inside the Pentagon's force generation model, there is a category that rarely makes it into open reporting. It is sometimes referred to as surge readiness, sometimes as response posture, sometimes simply as the reserve. It refers to carriers that are not officially deployed, not formally tasked, not announced in fleet movements, but are nonetheless held at a state of readiness that allows them to sortie within days rather than weeks. In a normal year, 1 or 2 carriers sit in this condition. In a tense year, that number rises quietly. And in the current posture, at least 1 carrier, possibly more, has been pulled forward into a state that mirrors a wartime alert without ever crossing the threshold of public deployment. That is the 8th carrier. Not a phantom. Not a rumor. A structural fact buried inside the rotation cycle. And it is the variable that changes the entire deterrence calculus. Because the question Iranian planners must now ask is not whether they can absorb a strike from 7 carriers. It is whether they can absorb a strike from 7 carriers and then survive the arrival of the 8th, fully rested, fully armed, and freshly worked up, while their own air defenses, missile inventories, drone stockpiles, and command nodes are already degraded from the first wave. That is not an incremental problem. That is a geometric one. To see why, look at the architecture of Iranian deterrence as it currently stands. Iran's defensive doctrine relies on 3 layers. The first is the missile and drone forces of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, with thousands of ballistic missiles, cruise missiles, and one-way attack drones distributed across hardened sites and mobile launchers. The second is the proxy network, stretching from southern Lebanon through Syria, Iraq, Yemen, and into the maritime choke points of the Red Sea and the Strait of Hormuz. The third is the asymmetric naval force, dominated by swarms of fast attack craft, midget submarines, coastal anti-ship batteries, and naval mines, designed to make the Persian Gulf an unworkable battlespace for any conventional fleet. Each of those layers is built around a core assumption. The assumption is that any American strike will be limited, time-boxed, and politically constrained. Iran's entire deterrence model is calibrated to absorb a measured blow, retaliate visibly, and force a return to the diplomatic table before the campaign can deepen. That model has worked for decades. It worked through the tanker wars. It worked through the Soleimani strike. It worked through the Red Sea engagements. It works because the cost-benefit calculation in Washington has always favored restraint over escalation. But the seven-carrier posture, combined with the hidden eighth, breaks that assumption. Because for the first time in over a generation, the United States is not assembling a force calibrated for a limited strike. It is assembling a force calibrated for a sustained campaign. And those are not the same thing. A limited strike requires one carrier, two at most, a handful of submarines, and a tight package of standoff weapons. It is designed to deliver a message and withdraw. A sustained campaign requires layered air superiority, persistent ISR, suppression of enemy air defenses across multiple nights, deep magazine depth in escort vessels, forward refueling, and most critically, the ability to rotate strike packages so that the tempo never drops. Seven carriers does not just deliver a message. Seven carriers, with an eighth in reserve, delivers the option of a campaign that does not stop until specific objectives are met. That is the difference between presence and pressure. And that is why this posture is being read so carefully in Tehran, in Moscow, in Beijing, and in every capital that depends on the assumption of American restraint. Now look at the geography. The Eastern Mediterranean carrier covers the Levant, holding Hezbollah and Syrian air defenses at risk. The Red Sea presence, anchored by amphibious groups and rotating carrier coverage, controls the southern approaches and the Houthi missile envelope. The Gulf of Oman positions a strike group within range of Iran's southern coast, the Strait of Hormuz, and the deep interior via standoff weapons. Each carrier covers a slice of the threat geometry. Together, they form an envelope. And that envelope is not symbolic. It is targeting. Because every carrier in that arc carries roughly 40 to 50 strike-capable aircraft. Every escort destroyer carries between 90 and 96 vertical launch cells. Every cruiser carries 122. The submarines, the ones publicly acknowledged and the ones that are not, carry tomahawks in numbers that have never been disclosed. When you sum the magazine depth across 7 strike groups, the number of precision weapons available on day one of a conflict reaches into the multiple thousands. That is not a strike package. That is an opening salvo. But here is where the current structure becomes vulnerable. Because magazine depth, however large, is finite. Modern campaigns burn through precision munitions at rates that even the Pentagon has acknowledged as unsustainable. The Red Sea engagements against Houthi drones and missiles have already drawn down American interceptor stocks at a pace that alarmed planners. A full campaign against Iran, with thousands of incoming ballistic missiles, cruise missiles, and drones, would consume interceptors faster than the industrial base can replace them. That is the hidden vulnerability inside the seven-carrier posture. Not the hulls. The ammunition. And that is where the eighth carrier matters in a way most observers will miss. Because the eighth carrier is not just additional firepower. It is additional time. It is the asset that arrives after the first magazines are spent, after the first interceptor stocks are degraded, after the first escort screens have rotated out for resupply. It is the force that ensures the campaign does not pause. And in a war against a country whose entire doctrine depends on forcing a pause, the elimination of that pause is the elimination of the doctrine. This is not about more power. It is about what that power removes. It removes the option of waiting out the first wave. It removes the option of betting on American fatigue. It removes the option of assuming the political clock will close the military window. And once those options are removed, the entire structure of Iranian deterrence has to be rebuilt in real time, under fire, against an opponent that has already mapped every node. Now consider what happens if the situation escalates. The first hours of any conflict would likely begin with a massive Iranian missile and drone barrage, designed to overwhelm regional defenses and force American carriers to expend interceptors. Saturation is the entire point. Iran does not need to sink a carrier. It only needs to force the strike groups to burn through their defensive inventory faster than they can replenish it. If the calculation works, the carriers must withdraw to rearm, and the campaign loses momentum. That is the Iranian bet. But the seven-carrier posture is specifically designed to defeat that bet. With 7 strike groups layered across 3 theaters, the defensive burden is distributed. No single group has to absorb the full weight of the saturation attack. And with the 8th carrier held in surge readiness, even if one or two strike groups must rotate out to rearm, the offensive tempo continues uninterrupted. The Iranian doctrine of forcing a pause collides with an American doctrine designed to refuse one. That is where the geometry shifts decisively. Because once the first wave is absorbed without forcing an American withdrawal, the initiative transfers. Iranian air defenses, already strained by the volume of incoming American and Allied munitions, begin to degrade. Command and control nodes, hardened but not invulnerable, begin to lose redundancy. Mobile launchers, however dispersed, begin to surface as they reload. The IRGC's missile force, designed for a short, sharp exchange, finds itself in a longer fight than its doctrine accounts for. And every additional day of sustained American pressure compounds the structural damage. That is when the proxy network becomes the next pressure point. Hezbollah, the Houthis, the Iraqi militias, all of them face a choice. Escalate fully and risk being targeted directly by an American force that now has the bandwidth to handle multiple fronts simultaneously, or hold back and watch the Iranian core absorb the campaign alone. Either choice degrades the deterrence model. Either choice exposes the structural weakness that the 7-carrier posture was designed to reveal. And underneath all of this sits the economic layer. The Strait of Hormuz carries roughly 20% of global oil consumption. Any sustained conflict threatens that flow, and any threat to that flow translates directly into global energy markets, inflation pressure, and political consequences in every capital that depends on stable supply. Iran has long counted on this economic leverage as a deterrent of its own. The assumption is that Washington cannot afford a prolonged conflict because the global economy cannot afford a prolonged closure of the strait. But here, too, the current posture rewrites the math. Because 7 carriers, with an 8th in reserve, are not just a strike force. They are a sea control force. They are the assets that keep the strait open under fire, that escort tankers through contested waters, that suppress mine-laying operations, and that neutralize the fast-attack craft swarms before they can reach commercial shipping. The economic deterrent works only if Iran can credibly close the strait. If the American posture makes that closure militarily impossible, the deterrent collapses. And that collapse is the quietest, most consequential shift in the entire equation. Because for 40 years, the foundation of Iranian strategic patience has been the belief that the costs of confronting Iran are higher than the benefits. Remove that belief, and every calculation downstream changes. The nuclear timeline changes. The proxy posture changes. The regional alignment changes. The willingness of Gulf states to hedge between Washington and Tehran changes. The Russian and Chinese assessments of American resolve change. This is the hidden meaning behind the 7-carrier deployment. It is not a warning. It is a recalibration. It is the United States demonstrating, in steel and aviation fuel and vertical launch cells, that the assumptions that have governed the region for a generation are no longer valid. And the 8th carrier is the proof that this recalibration is structural, not theatrical. Because a theatrical posture would deploy the visible force and stop. A structural posture deploys the visible force and quietly prepares the next one. A theatrical posture is designed to be photographed. A structural posture is designed to be survived. The presence of a reserve carrier, held at surge readiness, signals that the planners behind this deployment are not betting on a single decisive moment. They are preparing for a campaign whose duration they cannot fully predict, but whose tempo they intend to control. That is the difference between a show of force and a force in being. Now ask the question the entire script has been building toward. What happens if Iran does not blink? Because the 7-carrier posture is not just deterrence. It is a test. It is an offer of a final off-ramp before the geometry hardens into something neither side can easily reverse. If Tehran reads the signal correctly and pulls back, the carriers rotate home, the reserve stands down, and the region returns to its uneasy equilibrium. But if Tehran reads the signal as bluff, or if internal politics inside Iran make a pullback impossible, the entire posture pivots from deterrent to executor. And the 8th carrier, the one nobody is photographing, becomes the asset that ensures the pivot is irreversible. That is the threshold the region is now standing on. And it is a threshold that will not be visible until it is already crossed. Because in this kind of standoff, the move that matters is not the one in the headlines. It is the one being prepared while the headlines are still focused on the obvious. 7 carriers is what the world is counting. The 8th is what the planners are counting on. What matters is not just what is already on the map. It is what can arrive on the map before the first counterstrike finishes burning. And right now, both sides know exactly what that arrival would mean. If you found this analysis valuable, subscribe for more strategic breakdowns like this one, and watch the next briefing as the situation continues to develop.